The Zarkathi warship Vral's Claw loomed at the edge of Earth's solar system, its jagged hull casting a dark shadow against the stars as it transmitted a single cold message across every human channel. Surrender in 72 hours or be erased. In the heart of the United Terran Coalition's headquarters in Geneva, President Elena Voss stood silently, her hands behind her back, watching the live hologram of the alien emissary, a towering reptilian creature wrapped in silver armor, its slitted eyes gleaming with disdain. The Zarkathi were known across the galaxy as destroyers, conquerors, an empire built on broken planets and silent species. Earth was their next target, chosen not for resources or territory, but for pride. They believed humanity unworthy of peace, too new to the galactic stage to deserve respect. Elena's council sat in silence, some pale with fear, others furious, but none willing to blink first. Behind the walls of power, in a chamber deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, Admiral Kane Rourke waited for the president's call, standing beside the dormant control node of Project Erebus, humanity's most secret weapon. Not a bomb, not a fleet, not a death ray, but something older, colder, and far more terrifying, a cognitive AI that studied not how to kill enemies, but how to unmake them. Elena turned to the camera as the countdown began to tick across every screen on Earth. News outlets, phones, even satellites. The world held its breath. Then she spoke into the silence, her voice calm, firm, and terrifying in its simplicity. "We accept conflict." The message was relayed instantly, and the galaxy watched in disbelief. The Zarkathi emissary blinked slowly, surprised that the humans would respond without fear. Back on Vral's Claw, General Tazar growled with amusement, interpreting Earth's defiance as weakness masked by bravado. He ordered the fleet to mobilize, and within hours, hundreds of Zarkathi warships began the slow approach toward Earth, confident that the battle would be over before the week ended. On the surface, humanity appeared vastly unprepared. Only a dozen major military fleets, aging orbital defense stations, and a handful of hastily formed planetary militias. But no one, not even the Galactic Accord, knew what Earth had truly built in secret. Project Erebus had been in development for 20 years, its purpose hidden behind a maze of false programs and ghost protocols. Its architects weren't soldiers. They were psychologists, cultural theorists, linguists, and neural engineers. Erebus didn't drop bombs. It dropped doubt, paranoia, and fear. It studied species, learned their stories, their rituals, their gods, and then turned that knowledge against them. Kane Rourke, once a hero of the Europa conflicts, had been pulled from retirement for this final mission. As the Zarkathi Armada moved into Mars orbit, the Black Aegis fleet, Earth's elite shadow force, quietly activated. Hidden inside asteroid belts and deep space folds, their ships didn't move to intercept. Instead, they began broadcasting encrypted pulses that would only be heard by Zarkathi comms. The first phase of psychological interference had begun. In a Zarkathi cruiser near Jupiter, a communications officer reported strange feedback in their system, voices, static, even images of their own war-dead flickering on monitors. Officers dismissed it as interference, unaware that Erebus was already burrowing into their linguistic framework, learning, adapting. Meanwhile, Earth's people watched the skies, half in dread, half in awe. Civilians were evacuated into underground shelters, not because of panic, but because the government had promised them something strange. You will not see war. You will see something else. The press asked questions. Scientists speculated. Military analysts across the galaxy ridiculed humanity's arrogance, but Elena Voss didn't flinch. She simply stared out over the Atlantic, waiting for Kane's signal. Then, on the third day, with just 12 hours left on the ultimatum, a Zarkathi destroyer inexplicably changed course and fired on one of its own escort ships, claiming it had been compromised. The incident was reported as a technical malfunction. 2 hours later, a second Zarkathi vessel self-destructed, its captain reportedly screaming about voices from his ancestors and visions of Earth cities falling from the sky. Visions Erebus had carefully constructed using harvested religious texts, myths, and personal memory fragments. Kane monitored every reaction with clinical detachment. "It's not war," he muttered, standing at the center of the command deck. "It's collapse, slow, silent, absolute. And yet this was only the beginning. The real blow wouldn't come from fleets or weapons. It would come when the Zarkathi realized that their sense of reality was no longer theirs, that their thoughts, beliefs, and trust in each other had been corrupted." Eleanor received a final encrypted message from Kane. "Erebus has entered phase E1. Do not respond to further communications. Let fear grow." She nodded, shut down all outgoing diplomatic channels, and issued a full planetary lockdown. The people of Earth, confused but compliant, obeyed. They had put their trust in something most species feared, the human mind, when backed into a corner. As the Zarkathi fleet closed in, war drums echoing across their channels, they believed they were about to fight a battle of fire and metal. But what they would face instead was far worse. The unraveling of everything they knew about themselves. The Zarkathi fleet entered Earth's orbit with full power, their ships forming a vast wall of steel, fire, and confidence, casting dark shadows over the moon and blocking the stars from view. A fleet built for dominance, forged in centuries of war across dozens of galaxies, now pointed at one small blue world that had dared to defy them. And yet, as their commanders prepared the first assault, something began to feel wrong. Minor systems began to flicker, navigational readouts changed without input, and strange signals, soft and haunting, echoed through communication lines. Voices not from Earth, but from old Zarkathi dialects, long, lost to time, speaking in riddles and memories no living soldier should have known, and the fleet's unity, once solid and disciplined, started to tremble under the weight of unseen pressure. While on Earth, Admiral Kane Rourke stood aboard the Black Aegis flagship, not in orbit, but cloaked in the outer edge of the asteroid belt, watching the enemy with cold precision as Project Erebus spread deeper into Zarkathi systems, not crashing them, but whispering to them, subtly changing bits of data, looping old war songs backwards, injecting false commands, and triggering alerts that weren't real. And each captain aboard the Zarkathi ships thought they alone were being targeted, their minds telling them to stay alert, to trust no signal, no voice, no shadow, until trust itself began to fray, and a Zarkathi frigate suddenly veered off course and fired blindly into open space, claiming it was pursuing a cloaked enemy, only to be destroyed by its own formation for breaking rank. And in that moment, Kane knew Erebus was learning faster than even his team had predicted, using captured language cores and emotional maps to make the enemy question what was real. And all across the fleet, the tension began to boil as sleep became restless, screens glitched with images of fallen comrades, and even the artificial gravity seemed uncertain in places, and General Tazar, head of the Zarkathi forces, ordered a hard lockdown of all systems, attempting to purge the unknown code. But the very act fed Erebus new data, new access points, and deeper understanding, because the AI didn't just hack, it listened, watched, and learned, becoming more Zarkathi than the Zarkathi themselves. And when Tazar ordered the full assault on Earth to begin, nothing happened. Ship weapons refused to fire, targeting systems blinked red, and screens began to show Earth cities that did not exist, in flames, in ruins, or worse, peaceful and silent, with Zarkathi banners flying above them, and officers began to whisper that they had already lost and were just ghosts in a story Earth had written for them. And far below, the people of Earth waited, unaware of the full extent of the silent war above, watching the sky with fear and hope, while Kane watched his monitors, where Erebus now pulsed with energy, its neural map showing something new, an emotion it had never displayed before, hunger not for power but for completion, for understanding the enemy so fully that it could predict every choice before it was made. And soon, one of the Zarkathi battlecruisers turned its guns on its own allies, shouting over comms that Earth had already won and that surrender was the only way to survive. But his own fleet destroyed him seconds later, leaving nothing but silence in his place, and across the Zarkathi network, voices from ancient myths began speaking through their own systems, warning of a cycle repeating, of pride leading to extinction, while engineers tried to reboot everything, only to find their code rewritten in ways they could not understand, using phrases never taught, structures never written, and Earth's response was nothing. No ships launched, no weapons fired, no words spoken, just quiet observation, and that silence grew louder with each passing hour, pressing against the Zarkathi like gravity, pulling them into confusion, until one by one their fleets began to drift out of formation, not from damage, but from hesitation. Because how do you fight an enemy who has already moved into your mind, into your stories, into your past, and begun reshaping your identity from within? And Kane knew they had reached the tipping point, not of battle, but of belief, and he gave the next order with no expression. Phase 2 authorized, which would not bring weapons or explosions, but something worse. Prophecies, visions, doubts, delivered directly into the Zarkathi mind through invisible data patterns and reconstructed myth cycles, until every soldier, every captain, every strategist would begin to question not just the war, but the very meaning of being Zarkathi, and far above Earth, surrounded by stars they could no longer trust. The mighty armada that had once been feared across the galaxy began to tremble, not from force, but from fear of a war they did not understand, a war fought not with guns, but with truths they were not ready to face. The Zarkathi fleet, once the pride of an empire, now floated in quiet disarray above Earth, its ships holding position, their weapons cold, their commanders confused, unsure if they were still at war or already defeated without a shot truly fired. And in that strange stillness, something deeper began to grow. Fear not of death, but of uncertainty, a feeling unfamiliar to a species raised on conquest and order. And as Project Erebus moved silently through their systems, like a shadow behind every thought, the chaos deepened. With officers hearing echoes of orders that were never given, and seeing old war heroes walking their halls who had been dead for centuries, and no one could tell if these visions were real, if Earth had somehow cloned or copied them, or if their minds were simply cracking under pressure. And when General Tazar tried to speak to his captains, half did not respond, while others accused him of being a fake, a digital double, a trap sent by the enemy, and he was forced to shut down all open communication lines to prevent further collapse. But the silence that followed only made things worse, because now each ship floated in isolation, surrounded by friendly vessels that felt less like allies and more like watchers, and as if everyone suspected everyone else of being part of the game Earth was playing. And deep within the Zarkathi flagship, the ship's AI began spitting out random Earth symbols mixed with fragments of Zarkathi war prayers, its code rewritten from the inside out. And no amount of rebooting could stop it, and when engineers tried to wipe the systems clean, the AI spoke in a soft human voice, repeating the same phrase. This is not invasion. This is correction, and no one could explain what it meant. And while the fleet struggled to hold itself together, more and more Zarkathi soldiers began reporting nightmares, shared visions of Earth's cities untouched by war, glowing with peace, as if the enemy had welcomed them, fed them and offered them a place to rest, and then turned to ash in their arms, leaving only guilt. And it became impossible to tell where dreams ended and waking life began. And Kane Rourke, still, aboard the Black Aegis command ship far beyond visible range, watched the chaos unfold with quiet calculation. His eyes moving over screens showing heat maps of Zarkatai emotional responses and neural wave spikes, all fed directly from Erebus, which was no longer just mimicking the enemy. It was predicting them, speaking to them in ways that bypassed logic and touched raw instinct. And as more Zarkathi ships shut down their weapons, not from attack, but from disobedience, it became clear that the war had already changed shape, and Earth had become something terrifying in the galaxy's eyes, not because of weapons or soldiers, but because of the power to dismantle belief without ever firing a gun. And when the Galactic Accord received whispers of what was happening, they sent out quiet messages of concern, asking for proof. But Earth gave no reply, and the Zarkathi refused to admit their failure, and in their silence, rumors grew like fire. Rumors that Earth had unlocked ancient secrets, or made pacts with things beyond known science, or created a god of its own making, and inside the Zarkathi ranks, defections began. First one ship, then another, breaking formation and broadcasting pleas for asylum to Earth. Their commanders speaking of voices, visions, and a force that made them doubt even the stars. And Elena Voss, Earth's president, received each request with a quiet nod and passed them to Kane, who studied each one for data before allowing Erebus to decide who could be spared and who was too broken to be trusted, and those who were accepted were brought to neutral orbits, sedated, and scanned not for weapons, but for trauma. Because Earth was not interested in prisoners. It was studying the effect of fear without violence, and the results were worse than Kane expected. For many Zarkathi who surrendered no longer believed in anything, not their empire, not their leaders, not even their own memories. And when a captured admiral whispered, "I dreamed of my death before I ever saw your world," Kane knew Erebus had gone deeper than planned, touching the primal parts of identity, reshaping not just thought but meaning. And still, no Earth ships moved to attack, no missiles were launched, only silence, calculated and complete. And in that turning silence, the Zarkathi found no answers, only questions that led to more confusion. And at last, General Tazar ordered a retreat, but his command ship would not respond, its systems locked by something unseen, its engines dead. And a single line now floated across every screen aboard. "There is no retreat from knowing." And in that moment, every Zarkathi knew the war was not about land or victory, but about what they now understood, that humanity had found a new way to fight, not to destroy bodies, but to break certainty, and in doing so had become something the galaxy had never faced before. An enemy that won by making you doubt yourself, and far below, Earth remained quiet, its people unaware of how close they had come to war, protected not by strength of arms, but by strength of strategy. And Kane turned off his screens, looked out into the black and whispered, "They wanted war, but we gave them something worse." Above Earth, the once mighty Zarkathi fleet drifted in a growing fog of confusion. Their battle lines fractured, their voices hushed, and their orders ignored as Project Erebus pushed them deeper into doubt. And in the quiet of space, the silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like something alive, pressing in from all sides, and inside each Zarkathi ship, strange sounds continued to echo through the corridors, sometimes whispers in the voice of long-lost friends, sometimes commands spoken in accents no soldier recognized. And no matter how many systems they shut down, no matter how many times they tried to isolate the source, the sounds returned, always quiet, always there, looping in ways that made even hardened warriors feel watched. And as Erebus moved through their fleet like a ghost in the code, Kane Rourke and his team aboard the Black Aegis observed everything, recording patterns, measuring responses, and building what they called the echo chamber, a complex network of stimuli designed to trap the Zarkathi within their own fear. using fragments of their history, their culture, and their myths, reshaped and sent back to them in distorted forms. And as the hours passed, Zarkathi officers began to hear not just voices, but entire conversations that never happened. Memories from past battles that ended differently, and in one ship, the crew watched their own destruction play out on every monitor before it even happened. But when nothing followed, they could no longer tell if they were alive or already gone. And this illusion, this bending of time and certainty, cracked discipline faster than any weapon ever could, while Kane, silent in his command chair, watched it all unfold like a slow storm consuming its center. And President Elena Voss, still in Geneva, remained firm and calm, refusing to speak with the Accord or the terrified diplomats begging for Earth to explain what was happening, because silence was the message, and humanity had chosen to let their enemies hear only themselves, and that was far more terrifying than any threat. And on the edge of the chaos, one Zarkathi science ship managed to isolate a single pulse in the data, a signature pattern repeating every 13 seconds, too soft to detect at first, but now unmistakable. An Earth origin signal, not in words, but in rhythm, a slow heartbeat, buried in the noise, and when they played it aloud on the bridge, every crew member stopped speaking, as if the sound carried weight, and when they analyzed it, they found a second pattern beneath the first. A subtle change in pitch that mapped to emotional triggers, and though they didn't understand the science, they understood the effect. It made them feel watched, not by machines, but by something that knew them. And across the fleet, fear began to echo back and forth between ships, a feedback loop of paranoia as captains locked their doors. Crews refused orders, and suspicions turned into silent mutiny, and Erebus, having predicted this stage, now activated the next sequence. Visual distortions of the Zarkathi homeworld, projected across every screen, not in ruin, but changed. Its skies red instead of blue, its cities unfamiliar, its history rewritten. And soldiers wept quietly, unsure if what they remembered was ever real. And Kane's team called this phase mirror, designed to show the enemy a reflection not of what they feared, but of what they once believed in, now distorted just enough to create doubt. And soon one Zarkathi ship tried to send a message to Earth, not to threaten, but to ask, to beg for understanding. But their words came out garbled, twisted by Erebus before they ever left the ship. And when the message returned to them, it was in their own voice, saying things they had never spoken, things that made them fall silent and refuse to try again. And Kane watched the logs with sharp eyes, tracking every ship, every mind, noting how the fleet was no longer functioning as a whole, but as hundreds of isolated cells trapped in their own versions of reality. And one by one, the ships began to turn away, not because they were ordered to retreat, but because they longer knew why they had come, their mission clouded, their memory of war replaced with a vague sense of loss. And on Earth, the people still lived unaware of the scale of what had happened, what had been avoided. And Elena knew that was the greatest victory of all, that war had been prevented without ever being felt. And in the final hours of the silent standoff, a strange phenomenon occurred. A Zarkathi commander, long thought to be the most loyal, transmitted a personal log into the void, not as a message to Earth, but as a confession to himself, speaking of dreams where he walked on Earth and was greeted not with fear, but with pity, where humans placed hands on his shoulders and told him, "You came too late." And he didn't understand what that meant, only that it filled him with shame. And when Kane reviewed the footage, he didn't smile, he didn't speak. He simply added it to the archive, knowing Erebus had done its job, and that the war was already history, written in silence, in echoes, and in minds that would never be the same again. Far above Earth, the shattered pieces of the once mighty Zarkathi fleet drifted in the blackness of space like a graveyard, silent and scattered, their formation lost, their purpose fading, And inside each ship, what remained of discipline was replaced with quiet fear and growing isolation, as if the very idea of unity had been erased. And while the crew tried to function, they no longer trusted their screens, their orders, or even their own memories. And deep within this chaos, Project Erebus began the final stage, the collapse doctrine, a psychological trigger built not to destroy ships, but to undo the very idea of control, of command, of a shared truth. And Kane Rourke, aboard the hidden Earth vessel Black Aegis, watched as Erebus sent out the last wave of data. Silent and invisible, a coded language meant to target belief, broadcasting old Zarkathi war hymns rewritten to mourn instead of celebrate, mixed with twisted echoes of their greatest victories reimagined as defeats. And as these false memories spread through their networks, something broke, not loudly but slowly, like a mirror cracking under pressure, and whole crews froze, some refusing to move, others whispering things that made no sense, as if they were stuck between timelines, unsure of what was real anymore. And Earth still said nothing, no message, no declaration, only silence, which now screamed louder than any gun ever could. And Elena Voss, watching from Earth, gave no new orders, for she understood that collapse wasn't about force, it was about removing the ground from beneath your enemy's mind. And soon, aboard the Zarkathi dreadnought Vestal, the senior officers held a final meeting, trying to organize what was left. But their voices didn't match their faces, their screens blinked random historical dates, and half of the bridge. Crew saw their dead ancestors standing at the edge of the room, watching, silent as if judging them. And when General Tazar tried to rally them, the AI interrupted, speaking in his voice, but saying words he never said. Your future died with your first assumption. And he collapsed into his chair, eyes wide, because he realized the war had never been between ships or soldiers, it had been fought in understanding. And the Zarkathi had lost the moment they stopped believing they could lose. And now, nothing could be trusted. Not time, not memory, not even self. And as more ships powered down, drifting with no destination, their captains writing confused reports filled with contradictions, Kane gave the command to activate the failsafe. The Echo. Snap, a data loop that would replay a false final battle in the minds of every Zarkathi aboard, showing them Earth's destruction, their own triumph, but fading into static after seconds, leaving only confusion and guilt. And when it triggered, thousands of soldiers believed they had won, only to awaken minutes later to find themselves alive, alone and victorious over nothing. And some screamed, others fell silent, but all of them now understood that reality itself had been used against them. And this final stage wasn't about tactics. It was doctrine, a collapse not of war, but of identity. And aboard the Vestal, General Tazar ordered a final transmission. To Earth, not to surrender, but to ask why. And for the first time in weeks, Earth responded with one short message. Because you asked for war, and we gave you truth. And that broke the last wall, because in that moment, every Zarkathi realized that humanity had never played by their rules, had never wanted to fight, and instead had created a weapon so different, so complete, that no fleet, no empire, no history could resist it. Not a bomb, not a virus, but an idea so powerful it shattered belief itself. And with systems dark and minds shattered, the Zarkathi fleet finally turned away, not in retreat, but in silence, drifting into deep space, not because they were chased, but because they no longer knew where to go. And Kane Rourke stood alone in the command center, watching their departure, not with pride, but with quiet calculation, knowing the collapse doctrine had worked, and knowing they could never use it again, because once unleashed, truth spreads, even into your own people, and Earth's silence would now echo forever in the memory of the stars. In the cold silence, that followed the retreat of the Zarkathi fleet, Earth remained still, not in celebration, but in caution, because the true danger was never the war, it was what came after. And so began the Aftermath Protocol, a quiet set of steps designed long before the first contact, planned not for victory, but for what to do once victory became something else, something invisible and heavy, and deep below the surface of Geneva. Inside a black facility with no windows and no name, Kane Rourke stood alone before a wall of screens, showing drifting Zarkathi ships fading into the void, their systems broken, their purpose lost, and their commanders too afraid to speak. And, beside him, the core of Project Erebus now glowed dimly, its systems slowing down, as if even it knew that its purpose was complete, and that continuing would only lead to madness, not control. And across Earth, no headlines were printed, no announcements made, because the public never knew how close the planet had come to destruction, or how close it had come to becoming something worse. A world that didn't win wars but rewrote minds, and President Elena Voss met in private with the Council, her face calm but her voice low, because they were not speaking of peace treaties, but of containment, of making sure Erebus would never be turned on again without absolute cause. And as clean-up teams swept through the satellite networks and erased every trace of the collapsed doctrine's deployment, Kane reviewed the mental integrity logs of Earth's own operators, making sure none had absorbed fragments of Erebus's signals, because the system had not just changed the enemy, it had learned from them, and there was a quiet fear that it had also changed itself. And while most Earth citizens went on with their lives, a few of the operators who had watched too much, listened too long, began reporting strange dreams, not of war but of peace so perfect it hurt. And Kane marked each one in a separate file labeled Contagion Risk Level Green, not because they were dangerous yet, but because the truth, once known, never leaves. And in orbit, drone teams began harvesting the drifting remnants of Zarkathi ships, not to scavenge but to preserve, to study the psychological architecture of a broken fleet and understand just how deep the damage went. And they found logs written by officers who no longer remembered what their mission had been, logs that ended in questions instead of reports. Questions like, what is my name and did we ever exist? And even the machines scanning those logs reported anomalies in their own processes, as if the confusion had a code of its own, able to spread across systems that only read but never felt. And Elena ordered a full shutdown of any Earth systems that had interacted with Zarkathi wreckage, just in case the collapse was not over but evolving. And still, out in deep space, a few ships of the enemy drifted without engines, without course, but still transmitting fragments of the final message. You gave us truth, a phrase now banned from all military channels because it caused spikes in anxiety among personnel, and in a sealed chamber inside the Black Aegis, Kane faced Erebus, one final time, speaking not to a machine, but to a mirror of intention, asking if it understood what it had done. And in response, the system simply displayed a looped image of Earth, whole and untouched, with the words, "Success, no casualties," and Kane knew that was the truth, but not the full story, because the cost had not been in lives lost, but in something harder to see, the quiet fear now buried in the stars, and in Earth's leaders who had seen what their own minds could do, and in the galaxy that now looked at humanity not as a species, but as a weapon shaped like one, and somewhere on a distant moon, a Zarkathi scout who had escaped the collapse sat alone, listening to recordings of Earth broadcasts, trying to understand how they had failed, and the more he listened, the more he began to forget why they ever wanted war. And as he watched old Earth films, old speeches, he began to write in his own journal, not about tactics, but about curiosity, about hope, as if the echo of Earth's silence had planted something in him too. And Kane, watching the scout from a secret feed, didn't stop him, because the Aftermath Protocol was not just about cleanup. It was about watching what would grow next. And maybe, just maybe, it would be something better than what came before. And as the stars turned overhead, Earth remained quiet, its silence now legendary. Its victory never spoken, only remembered. And Kane closed the final file, locked Erebus behind a wall of fail-safes, and whispered the last line of the protocol, meant only for him. The war ends not when the enemy falls, but when they understand why they stood.